Once upon a time, in a faraway land in the heart of Africa, there was a small village called Obodoma. Obodoma was known for its beautiful fields of sunflowers and its kind-hearted people. The villagers lived peacefully, tending to their crops and sharing stories by the fire every single night. There lived a beautiful, cunning and charming young woman whose name was Ego. She was known throughout the village for her wit and outstanding beauty. Ego had a secret passion. She loved to play tricks on the men of the village and then disappear like a ghost. One sunny afternoon, Ego stumbled upon an old clay pot hidden in her father's hut. Inside the pot were beautiful, mysterious bright waist beads. The waist beads were very colorful and shiny. As soon as Ego laid eyes on them, she immediately loved them. She discovered that the waist beads had once belonged to her great-grandmother, a revered trickster and a healer. Ego asked her mother about the waist beads. She was told that the waist beads held magical powers, allowing their owner to outsmart even the cleverest of beings. Ego felt an instant connection to the beads. She began to feel the waist beads with her hands as mischievous plans began to unfold in her mind. She knew she had to use the powers of the waist beads to play the most epic trick anyone had ever seen nor heard. But she was disappointed when her mother told her that the waist beads were banned in their village, and anyone seen with them was instantly banished from the village, and in more severe cases, the person may be executed. Ego's disappointment was raining down her face, but she loved the waist beads and wanted to try the powers that was said they possessed. She decided to keep the waist beads in her possession, hoping that one day she would secretly try their powers on one of the men in their village. So, one day, Ego wore the waist beads. She observed herself and discovered that they looked very beautiful on her. Possessed by greed running through her mind to have the most fortune in the world, she decided to try the powers of the beads to see if the story about them was actually true. She waited till the sun began to set, and slowly she sneaked out of her hut, wearing the waist bead around her waist. She quickly headed to the compound of the wealthiest man in their village, whose name was Ebuigwe. Ebuigwe was very rich. He had 2 wives and 7 children. As soon as Ebuigwe set eyes on Ego, he smiled happily because he was secretly admiring her and had been making plans to meet her people and seek her hand in marriage. He and Ego began discussing. He was completely carried away with excitement of having Ego in his compound that he never noticed the beads on her waist. Ebuigwe's wives were peeping from their huts. Jealousy mixed with anger was running down on their faces. Not so long, Ebuigwe's second wife walked towards them, and quickly she noticed the forbidden beads on Ego's waist. She began to shout, pointing at the waist beads, which drew the attention of Ebuigwe on them. Not so long, the attention of the first wife and the children were also drawn. Ego wants to use the forbidden beads to steal our husband though. The second wife began to shout continuously. These shouts quickly got the attention of their neighbors. Ego immediately ran out of the compound. Ebuigwe stood with great shock in the midst of the gathered crowds. The situation was immediately reported to their king by Ebuigwe's wives and neighbors. Ego kept running like a woman hunted by a hungry lion. She crossed the boundary of their village deep into the forest. She then buried the beads under a tree. With a big stone, she continuously hit the tree trunk, making marks on it. When she was satisfied with the marks on the tree, she then returned to her village in the night. Without words to her mother, she retired to her hut. The next day, Ego was summoned to the palace by the king's guards. The king sat on his throne. His chiefs and elders were seated by his right side and left side. A large crowd from the village had also gathered with Ego's mother in their midst. Weeping tirelessly, Ego stood before the king and the chiefs, not having any form of remorse. "We have received a report that you, Ego, you had put on the beads which were banned from this village. Is that report true?" the king asked. Ego was silent, staring at the king. The crowd began to shout that Ego should be executed. "Where are the beads?" the king asked. Ego still kept mute. No words, no reactions. She just stood there, staring at the king. The king commanded his guards to go to Ego's compound and search for the beads in every nook and cranny of the compound. The guards immediately left. After a while, they returned and told the king they could not find the beads. But the wives of Ebiwe and neighbors kept insisting that they saw the beads on Ego's waist. Ebiwe's second wife said, "I was very sure what I saw, my king. The beads were shiny and beautiful. Anyone in this village knows the beads which were banned by your father, the late king. Ego should not be spared." The king turned and asked Ebiwe, "Ebiwe, did you see the forbidden beads on Ego's body yesterday?" "Yes, my king. I barely noticed until my second wife raised an alarm, which brought my eyes to them," Ebiwe replied. His second wife was busy, nodding her head in agreement. Ebiwe continued, "But my king, she should be pardoned. She is just a..." "Will you throw your tongue back in your mouth?" Ishie Elekwa, a ruthless chief, rudely interrupted Ebiwe. He stood as he continued, "It is people like you that will try to bend the justice of this land because you want to marry another wife. You should be thanking your chi that this young lady did not succeed with whatever that was in her mind against you and your family. That is what you should do, and not trying to bend the justice so you can go around and marry her. We all know that the forbidden beads bring nothing good, only evils, and that was why our late king banned it." The truth was blunt. Ebiwe quietly stepped back without any more words from him. The king, seeing Ego's silence, believed that the report about her was true and got her banished from the village, since she was not willing to say anything in her defense nor reveal the location where she kept the beads. The king instructed his guards to follow Ego to her hut, and under their watchful eyes, Ego should pack her belongings and exit the village immediately. He instructed the guards that they should make sure that Ego does not take the beads along with her. The guards led Ego out of the king's presence, and the crowd followed. Ego's mother continued to cry bitterly as she walked behind the guards. After Ego had packed her belongings, she was led to the boundary of the village by the guards. Her mother and other villagers stood, staring at her. Ego stared at her mother with tears in her eyes, but she managed to control them. She walked towards her mother and gave her one last hug and headed out of the village. The guards and the villagers stood staring at her as he vanished from their sight. Ego had reached a spot where she had buried the beads. She quickly identified the tree by the marks she had previously made on it. She dug the exact spot where she had buried the beads. She brought them out with happiness in her heart. She smiled and wore them and continued her journey. After 2 days, Ego had arrived in a village known as Nkuma. She was unlike anyone the villagers had ever seen. Ego had a smile that could charm anyone, and her laughter was like the tingling of the tiny bells. The villagers welcomed Ego with open arms. They were curious about her, for she had come from a distant land and no one knows much about her past. Ego told the villagers that she was looking for a place to settle down and make a home. The villagers, being kind and generous, offered her a place to stay. Little did they know that Ego was not as innocent as she seemed. Ego soon became the talk of the village. The young men of Nkuma were captivated by her beauty and grace. They would gather around her, trying to win her favor with gifts of fruits, honey, and the finest clothes. Ego, with her clever mind, knew exactly how to charm each and every one of them. One day, a wealthy farmer named Amade came to Ego with a proposal. Amade was strong, tall, and was known for his bountiful harvest of yams. He told Ego that he had fallen in love with her and asked her to be his wife. Ego smiled sweetly and agreed to marry him. The whole village rejoiced at the news. Soon, the preparation for the wedding began. The women of Nkuma wove the finest clothes for Ego's wedding dress, and the men prepared a feast with roasted yam, grilled fish, and with sweet palm wine. But Ego had a secret plan. The day of the wedding arrived. The whole villagers gathered to celebrate. Amade was overjoyed as he took Ego's hand in marriage. The drum beat loudly and the villagers danced until the sun set behind the mountains. That night, after the festives had ended, Amade led Ego to their new home. He was excited to start his life with his beautiful new bride, but Ego had other ideas. Ego quickly led Amade into the inner chamber and they both smashed. This was to get Amade tired. As soon as Amade slept, dreaming of the future, Ego quietly gathered all the gifts, gold coins, and valuable items in the house. She placed them in a large sack, carefully not to make a sound. Like a shadow in the night, Ego slipped out of the hut and disappeared into the darkness. When the morning sun rose, Amade woke to find his new bride gone. All that remained was an empty house, a sketch on the floor by Ego which read, "Thank you for the gifts, but I must be on my way." The news of Ego's disappearance spread quickly through Nkuma. The villagers were shocked and saddened by what had happened to Amade. They could not believe that the sweet, smiling Ego could do such a thing. Amade was very heartbroken, but he tried to move on. The villagers comforted him, telling him that he would find happiness again. But deep down, Amade could not forget Ego and the taste of her sweet body. Meanwhile, Ego traveled to the next village, carrying her sack of stolen goods. She had no intention of settling down at all. She was on a mission to trick as many men as she could, taking their wealth and moving on to the next village. Ego had now arrived at a new village called Osisioma, known for its fertile land and friendly people. She arrived with a new identity, claiming to be a noble woman from a distant land. The people of Osisioma were kind and welcomed her warmly. Ego quickly set her eyes on the village rich trader, a man named Obinna. She used her charm once again, and Obinna was soon enchanted by her beauty. Obinna began to shower Ego with gifts and affection. He admired her and praised her beauty. Ego told him stories of her travels and pretended to be deeply interested in his life. Obinna fell in love with Ego and decided to ask her to marry him. Ego, knowing her plan was working, accepted his proposal with a smile and without a waste of time. The village of Osisioma prepared for another grand wedding. The people were excited and decorated their homes with bright colors. The festival was to be the biggest the village had ever seen. Ego, however, was secretly planning her escape. She knew that once she was married to Obinna, she would take his wealth and leave. On the day of the wedding, the land of Osisioma was alive with joy. The villagers danced and sang. Obinna and Ego exchanged vows by the river. The ceremony was beautiful and everyone was happy. As the festivities ended, Ego quietly gathered valuable items from Obinna's home. She packed her sack and prepared to leave under the cover of darkness. The next morning, Obinna woke up to find Ego gone and his wealth missing. He was devastated and felt betrayed. He realized too late that Ego had tricked him. Obinna told the villagers what had happened. They were shocked. They couldn't believe that someone so charming could be so deceitful. The news of Ego's tricks spread quickly. Ego was happy as she had succeeded on this. Little did she know her action would catch up with her. Ego walked for days until she reached a village called Eziama. Eziama was by the great river where the villagers were known for their fishing skills. The air was filled with the scent of fresh fish and the river sparkled in the sunlight. As soon as Ego entered Eziama, she put on her sweetest smile. The villagers welcomed her warmly. They were curious about this stranger with the most beautiful beads. Ego told them the same story she had told in Nkuma and Osisioma. She was looking for a place to call a home. The villagers were kind and offered her a place to stay. She quickly made friends with the women, helping them to weave baskets and prepared meals. But her real interest was in the men of Eziama. She watched them carefully, waited for the right one to approach her. It didn't take long for a young fisherman named Ikenga to notice Ego. Ikenga was strong and hardworking, known for catching the biggest fish in the village. He was gentle and kind, and soon he was smitten with Ego. Ikenga began to bring Ego the best fish he had caught each day. He would tell her stories of his adventure on the river. Ego listened with interest, all the while planning her next move. One evening, Ikenga gathered his courage and asked Ego to marry him. Ego smiled and accepted his proposal. Just like in Nkuma, the whole village rejoiced because she was loved by many of them. They began preparing for a grand wedding by the river, but Ego always had other plans. The wedding was a grand affair. The villagers decorated the banks of the river with bright flowers and lanterns. The sound of drums and flutes filled the air as Ikenga and Ego exchanged vows. The women sang songs of love and the men danced joyfully. Ego looked stunning in her wedding dress. Made from the finest clothes the village had to offer, Ikenga was the happiest man in Eziama, and he couldn't wait to start his life with Ego. As night fell, the couple retired to their new home, a cozy hut near the river. After the new couple had finished smashing, Ikenga, tired and exhausted, and soon he fell into a deep sleep. Ego, however, was wide awake. As the moon shone through the window, Ego quietly got up and began to gather all the valuable items in the hut. She filled her sack with coins, jewelries, and anything she could find of value. Then, just as she had done before, she slipped out of the hut into the night, leaving Ikenga behind. When Ikenga woke up the next morning, he was excited to start his new life with Ego, but when he looked around, he realized that she was gone. He searched the hut, but all he could find was a sketch on the floor, which read, "Thank you for the gifts, but I must be on my way." Ikenga's heart sank. He couldn't believe that Ego had left him just like that. He felt betrayed and ashamed. How could he have been so blind? The villagers tried to comfort him, but Ikenga couldn't shake the sadness that had settled in his heart. Word soon spread through the land of Eziama of what had happened. The villagers were shocked and angry. They couldn't believe that Ego had tricked them. But as time passed, they began to understand that Ego was a clever trickster who had fooled them all. The village elders of Eziama, wise and experienced, gathered to discuss what had happened. They knew that they couldn't let Ego continue her tricks, for she would surely move on to another village and do same thing. "We must warn other villages," said Okoro, the oldest and wisest among them. "We cannot allow this trickster to continue deceiving the people." The elders decided to send messengers to the neighboring villages, warning them about Ego and her tricks. They described her appearance and told the villagers to be on a lookout for a beautiful woman with colorful and shiny beads on her waist, who would come with a sweet smile but a deceitful heart. Meanwhile, Ego was on her way to another village. Unaware that the villagers were spreading words of her tricks, she walked for days, crossing rivers and climbing hills, until she reached a village called Umunri. Umunri was a prosperous village known for its rich farmlands and strong warriors. Ego knew that this would be a perfect place to continue her tricks. As she entered the village, she noticed that the people were welcoming but also curious. She would need to be even more careful in Umunri. But Ego, with her clever mind and quick wit, was confident that she could outsmart anyone who stood in her way. Little did she know that the villagers of Umunri had already heard of her, and they were ready to give her a taste of her own medicine. The people of Umunri were proud of their village, known for its wise elders and brave warriors. They have heard stories of Ego, the trickster, and were prepared to face her cunning ways. As Ego entered, Ego noticed that the wealthiest man in the village was a merchant named Ago. Ago was known for trading goods with faraway lands, and his home was filled with treasures from across the continent. Ego knew that Ago would be her next target. Ego began to weave her web of deceit. One day at the marketplace, pretending to be a traveler in need of help, Ago, being generous and kind, offered Ego a place to stay in his home. Ego quickly won Ago's trust with her charm and stories of her travels. She praised his wealth and told him how fortunate she was to have met someone as wise and successful as him. Ago, flattered by her words, began to fall under her spell. Ego carefully planned her next move. She knew if she could convince Ago to marry her, she would have access to all his wealth. But she also knew that the villagers were wary of strangers, so she had to be more careful and convincing than ever before. One evening, as Ego was sitting by the fire in Ago's home, there was a knock on the door. Ago opened it to find a traveler standing outside. The traveler introduced himself as Ikenna, a storyteller from a distant land. Ikenna asked if he could stay the night and share his stories with the villagers. Ago, always welcoming to guests, invited Ikenna in and offered him food and shelter. Ego was intrigued by this visitor. He watched him closely, wondering if he was another traveler or someone who could pose a threat to her plans. Ikenna seemed friendly and harmless, but there was something in his eyes that made Ego uneasy. That night, Ikenna entertained Ego and other villagers with his stories. He spoke of a distant land, brave warriors, and clever trickster. The villagers listened intently, captivated by his tales. But when Ikenna began to tell a story about a beautiful woman who tricked men into marrying her, only to steal their wealth and disappear, Ego's heart began to race. The story was too similar to her own life, and she wondered if Ikenna knew more than he was letting on. As Ikenna described how the trickster woman was eventually outsmarted by a wise old man, Ego grew nervous. She could feel the eyes of the villagers on her. She knew that they were starting to suspect something. The next morning, Ego woke early, troubled by Ikenna's story. She wondered if it was a warning, but she quickly dismissed the thoughts. "No one can outsmart me," she said to herself. But deep down, the seeds of doubt had been planted. Ago, unaware of Ego's fear, continued to treat her with kindness. He had started to develop feelings for her and was considering asking her to be his wife. Ego knew she had to act fast before Ikenna's story caused any more suspicion. A few days later, Ago finally asked Ego to marry him. He promised her a life of comfort and security. Ego, with her sweetest smile, agreed. The villagers were invited to celebrate the engagement, but Ego noticed that Ikenna was not among them. This made her even more uneasy. She wondered where Ikenna had gone, if he was planning something against her, but she pushed these thoughts aside and focused on her plan to gather all Ago's wealth on their wedding night. The village of Umuri was buzzing with excitement as the preparation for the wedding began. The women of the village wove beautiful clothes for Ego's wedding dress, and the men prepared a grand feast. But Ego, while appearing happy, was constantly on edge. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to reassure herself that everything would go according to plan, but Ikenna's story kept playing in her mind. The night before the wedding, Ikenna returned to the village. He had been away, gathering stories from nearby villages, but now he was back, just in time for the wedding. Ego's heart sank when she saw him. She tried to act calm, but inside she was panicking. She knew that Ikenna's story would ruin her plan, and she needed to find a way to get rid of him. But Ikenna was not easily fooled. He had been observing Ego since he first arrived in Umuri, and he knew she was not what he seemed. Ikenna decided that it was time to teach Ego a lesson. On the morning of the wedding, Ikenna approached Ago and Ego. He congratulated them and offered to tell them one last story before they were married. Ego, trying so hard to hide her discomfort, agreed.